The war in Ukraine is now in its second year. The US and Germany have worked closely to supply Ukraine with military aid, humanitarian assistance. But there is also, or has also been, friction over issues such as providing tanks. Washington has occasionally grown frustrated with Berlin's hesitance. President Biden met German Chancellor Olaf Scholz at the White House, and the two leaders vowed to keep imposing costs on Russia. This was Scholz's first visit to the US since the war. Maintaining a steady flow of weapons to Kyiv will be critical in the war's second year, especially with both sides planning spring offensives. Sitting next to Scholz in the Oval Office, Biden thanked the German leader for his strong and steady leadership and support for Ukraine. The US president hailed Scholz's decision to sharply increase Germany's military spending and diversify energy sources away from Russia. Biden said the two nations are making the NATO alliance stronger as the US announced a new military aid package for Ukraine.
I know it's not been easy, very difficult for you. Together we work lockstep to supply critical security assistance to Ukraine, and from everything from, we've done it in lockstep, ammunition, artillery, armored tanks, air defense systems, and we've been together throughout this. You help Ukraine meet its basic needs like food, health, heating, and you continue to give them, maintain the pressure on Putin, and it is undercutting his ability to fight this war. And so as NATO allies, we're making the alliance stronger and more capable.
Worth $400 million, the latest package includes ammunition and tactical bridges to move tanks and armored vehicles. The German Chancellor stated that Western allies will support Ukraine for as long as it takes.
Let me just say this is a very, very important year because of the very dangerous threat to peace that comes from Russia invading Ukraine. And it's really important that we acted together, that we organized our lockstep, and that we made it feasible that we can give the necessary support to Ukraine during all this time. And at this time, I think it is very important that we give the message that we will continue to do so as long as it takes and as long as it is necessary, and that we are ready also for staying with the Ukrainians as long as it is necessary.
Scholz's brief one-day trip was his second to the White House since taking office in December 2021. The German Chancellor's trip lacked the customary press conference where the two leaders take questions from reporters representing both countries. Biden's national security advisor also met one-on-one with his German counterpart. As per reports, Washington has begun consulting with allies about imposing possible sanctions on China should Beijing provide military support to Russia. Germany has typically taken a much less hawkish stance than the United States on China, its top trading partner. But on Thursday, Scholz sent a strong warning to China over any deliveries of weapons to Russia. He appealed to Beijing to pressure Russia to pull back its forces, a speech noted and welcomed by U.S. officials. Meanwhile, in another show of support for Ukraine, U.S. Attorney General made a surprise visit to the country to attend a conference on justice and war crimes. Some experts view the Russia-Ukraine war as a manifestation of the renewed geopolitical rivalry between major world powers. Analysts say Moscow is seeking to alter the Western-led system prevailing since the end of the Cold War. Western allies say the war has broken the entire security architecture built patiently on the European continent over many decades. The 30-nation NATO alliance says it is doing everything possible to avert a war similar to the one that ravaged Europe 80 years ago.
Трагічну долю своїх колег.
For more on this, we are now being joined by our correspondent Susan Teherani from New York, and also I'll be talking to Colonel David B. Roches in a short while. Susan, good to see you. Apart from the obvious, what else did the two leaders discuss, and what was the significance of Chancellor Scholz making a second trip to the United States?
Well, the significance really was this off-the-cuff meeting by Chancellor Scholz coming at a time when even members of parliament inside his own country were questioning him as to why he was taking this trip as he was leaving Berlin. And he really gave a one-line answer saying that it's better to meet in person. Journalists asked him why this meeting couldn't take place via video conference, and Chancellor Scholz then replied to journalists that he's in direct contact with President Joe Biden, and there is a significance in meeting face-to-face. It's important to note, as you mentioned, Eric, that the two men spoke for more than an hour face-to-face without their accompanying delegation. According to sources, when they did come out, President Biden half-jokingly said that we solved all of the world's problems. Wow, if anything got solved, we really didn't hear or read that in the president and the White House's official readout. All we did read was that the two men and leaders discussed the war and, quote, exchange perspectives on other global issues. But you know, this meeting really does come at a time when Russia is planning that spring offensive on the one hand. And on the other hand, as you mentioned, China is really a big issue that both countries are concerned about. The United States hoping to exert more pressure should China decide to provide more lethal aid to Russia. And on the other hand, Germany being a big trading partner with China, being a bit reluctant. The fact that the two men did not have a press conference begs the question on whether or not they really are on the same page regarding China, regarding the war, and whether perhaps European countries, Olaf Scholz being the Chancellor of Germany, prefer that a resolution is reached sooner than later than perhaps President Joe Biden. That's something that has been being floated around, despite the fact that on the surface, it seems that they are very intact. They say that we will stand with Ukraine until the very end, and any settlement or resolve to this conflict would have to be based on the UN Charter, which, you know, we've heard not only here in New York when leaders and foreign ministers met. We heard that during the G20 in India. And we're really hearing that on the surface from the leaders. Behind closed doors, things might be different. So that's one aspect of it. And then the leaders are also meeting at a time when public opinion really is fragile, to say the least. On the one hand, you know, you do have those polls coming out and saying that there is support for aid to Ukraine in both countries. But on the other hand, I think both leaders understand that their populations are becoming a little bit war weary. So, you know, it does come at a significant time. The fact that it was on a Friday afternoon, one can't really deny that fact either. But I think a lot more information will come out of this trip.
Live from New York, our correspondent Susan Teherani. Susan, thank you. Let's talk more about this. Colonel David B. Desroches is a professor at the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies, National Defense University. Colonel David is joining us from Washington. Colonel David, good to see you. 1 year into the war, we are still talking about arming Ukraine or imposing sanctions to China if it supports Russia and provides weapons to Russia. Many critics say this is doublespeak and will only intensify the conflict. What say you?
Well, I haven't heard many critics, but those people who say it are basically parroting Russia's line. I mean, yeah, it's true. The war could end if Ukraine were occupied or if Ukraine surrendered. The war could also end if Russia surrendered. But what we've seen is that, and quite frankly, people in the West were more prepared for defeat than for Ukrainian defiance. I think that what we've seen is that the Ukrainian fighting spirit is something that people all around the world, even people who, you know, were probably a little hesitant to support Ukraine, have realized is something that should be supported. The question is, how long can they support it? And, you know, if people who support Ukraine have the weapons and have the willpower to continue, you know, for another year or so.
Well, the United States has announced a new military aid package for Ukraine. Yesterday, when President Biden met with Chancellor Scholz, of $400 million US. And there's a person here who I'm told he's your friend, his name is Jack Watling. He's a senior research fellow for land warfare at the London-based Royal United Services Institute, and he says that assault bridging is essential for combined arms operations. It allows armored vehicles to cross narrow rivers and ditches that would otherwise cause a whole force to slow down. He's basically supporting this aid. Would you say so?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, what we've seen, we saw in the fall an entire Russian battalion trying to do a river crossing over the Severodonetsk River, and they were wiped out. I think it was more than 50 armored vehicles, and God only knows how many soldiers died because of the lack of effective bridging. These bridges are about maybe 50 yards long. They're a little bit less than that. They're deployed on a tank chassis, and they're designed, they're called ribbon bridges. They basically unfold like a ribbon mechanically very quickly, and then the chassis moves back and gets another bridge. So they can enable armored vehicles to make fast crossings over a limited area, not a big river, but a limited area. They can also use through minefields. So if Ukraine is to retake the initiative, what these do is they allow you to bypass small rivers, ditches, or trench works very, very rapidly. They're key capabilities for modern maneuver warfare.
Colonel David, let me ask you this. Why is Germany hesitant to provide Ukraine with tanks, despite the country remaining adamant that it will back Ukraine for as long as it takes?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I had a group of senior German officers in my classroom this week visiting, and we talked a little bit about that. I think the conclusion I've come to is that Germany wanted to do this, but Germany was afraid that they would be exposed to Russia after the war, or if American attention flags. So it's kind of the same logic we had with the deployment of intermediate nuclear forces in the 1980s at the height of the Cold War, where Germany was afraid that unless the United States had exposure to Russian nuclear weapons, or unless we had offensive nuclear capabilities on the ground in Europe, the United States and Russia might negotiate separately and leave the Europeans to their own fate. They've kind of applied this logic to tanks. They basically wanted to ensure that the United States was committed to applying tanks before it did so that any Russian retaliation, which could be years in the future, would also have to be directed towards the United States. That's not the most helpful position, but I think what really did damage for Germany's reputation was the fact that this wasn't done in private, it was done publicly. And so a lot of people, particularly in the American Congress, I think, they've forgotten that Germany is the second largest financial donor to Ukraine. And quite frankly, Germany's reputation has taken a hit from this.
Colonel David B. Desroches, thank you very much for your time and for talking to WION today.
It's an honor, Eric.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.